The topic of this last presentation will be barbarians as a connection between China and Russia. First of all, I want to thank our colleagues, Dr. Anka Dan and Professor Huang Qiang for the kind invitation and for organizing this conference. The barbarians are characterized in Western antiquity and in the history of China by the fact that little is known of them. They do not speak Greek or Latin. Their customs and way of life make them different from the Chinese way of life. But in general, neither their language, nor their religion, nor their customs give rise to descriptions, as if this knowledge were of no interest. When Ovid was exiled to Tomis, he suffered from the proximity of the Getae and was afraid he would finally imitate their language. But a description of this nation cannot be found neither in the Tristia nor in the letters from the Black Sea. Barbarians are all considered as threatening nations, even if it was difficult in the case of Egypt or Persia to deny them an advanced culture from which even Greece had been able to draw inspiration. The history of China involves many contacts with peoples who do not belong to the Chinese cultural area. They are also relatively undefined, and it is sometimes difficult to specify their linguistic, ethnic, and religious identity. At the beginning of Common Era, the north of China knew dynasty of Huns, Turks, and Tibetans. The Western Xia dynasty from the 11th to 12th century is a Tangut dynasty belonging to the Tibeto-Burman group. The Yuan dynasty from 1216 to 1368 is a Mongol dynasty, and the last dynasty of Chinese history, that of Qing, is a Manchu dynasty. The Yuezhi, living in Gansu, were Indo-European tribes, were driven back to the west by the Xiongnu, founded the Kushan Empire in the 1st century. They were perhaps related to the Huns, Hephthalites, whose strongholds have been found in Central Asia. These peoples, although they have reached a high cultural level, also historians such as Sima Qian made mention of their involvement in the ancient history of China, of the help they sometimes gave to some Chinese emperor to put down a rebellion, are not well known, as if their location outside Chinese culture remained a priority. They are generally nomadic tribes, whereas the Chinese are sedentary peasants, and this difference is enough to justify a radical difference. In a book published 10 years ago, Ethnic Identity in Tang China, Mark Abramson highlighted the construction of self-other dichotomy during the Tang dynasty. Every non-Han is a barbarian and may be compared with animals. Stereotype of non-Han untrustworthiness explains the rebellion of the barbarian general An Lushan. Because they had the capacity and powers of animals, barbarians developed special skills and could, for instance, raise horses better than Chinese people. The eroticized non-Han female dancers or the barbarian singers belong to Tang society, and many emperors had a great respect for Indian cultures. But the representation of the wild barbarians is deep-rooted in Chinese cosmology, which considers that all people living far from Luoyang were at a very poor level of civilization and literacy. Even the great poet Li Po had to conceal his barbarian origins. Whether it is the Turks or Mongols or the Tungus, the barbarians of China are often peoples connected to the north of the Chinese space, that is to say to Mongolia, but also more widely to southern Siberia. If China has never considered the study of these ethnic groups to be a priority, Russia was much more interested in their characteristics and their own history. A key moment was the reign of the Empress Catherine II, who entrusted the new Russian Academy of Sciences to explore the many ethnic groups that made up the population of the empire and the uncrowded and remote regions in which many of them were living. This vast project involved in particular the exploration of the Caucasus, but above all an exploration of Siberia. Large sums of money were devoted by the Russian government to this enterprise. The appointed travelers were not adventurers but scholars, generally Germans trained in the best German universities and therefore employed by Russia. The results of their surveys were to remain the property of the Academy of Sciences, but many German scholars published books on the people of Siberia. Among these are the names of Karl Heinrich Merck, who visited the Chukchi, Johann Georg Gmelin, who explored southern Siberia, notably the regions that separate Lake Baikal from China, Georg Wilhelm Steller, who analyzed the culture of the Itelmens in the Kamchatka, Gerhard Friedrich Müller, who developed an inventory of the archives concerning Siberia and explored the territory of the Yakuts, Peter Simon Pallas, who traveled through the regions beyond Lake Baikal and the Chinese border. These scholars, accompanied by interpreters, had in their luggage all the available literature and the existing maps. They were interested in all aspects of the countries they traversed. They have tried to understand the religious forms and especially the shamanic rites, which are known to have played an important role in the ancient history of China. Although these rites seemed very strange, the anthropologists, because these scholars were practically the first European anthropologists or ethnologists, who observed them do not always condemn them. They didn't condemn shamanism. They observed also the food practices, the clothes, the architecture of the houses. We have a picture of barbarian populations in northern China in all their diversity. Certainly, this portrait doesn't correspond chronologically to the warlike undertaking of the peoples whom the Great Wall attempted to contain outside China, but at least their descendants of the same family of peoples were directly concerned. Curiously, the role that the Siberian ethnic group may have played in Chinese history is not of particular interest to German explorers, even though they set up hypothetical routes of their migrations. They are particularly concerned with the relations that the peoples of Siberia had with North America through the Bering Strait. Among the figures of barbarians who represent a sort of union between China and Europe, there is first the Huns. They passed through an area of about 10,000 kilometers that extends from the Great Wall of China to the Roman limes. They were the living embodiment of the steppe population and of nomadism. They were probably the result of mixtures of people and are perceived in the Roman Empire for the first time at the end of the 4th century when they reached the Caucasus and come up against the Alans. They came from the boundary of China. Traces of their culture have been excavated in Xinjiang and Altai. They crossed the south of Russia in their wanderings. Of course, the Huns are characterized by their extreme brutality, but they also enter into relations with the Romans and a Roman general who grew up as a Huns hostage at the court of King Ruga spoke their language, allowing diplomatic negotiations with Rome. The Huns could be Christians and play a role in the strategy of Roman resistance to the other barbarians. In truth, the Huns do not remain a group with everlasting identity, and an ethnic mixing with the Ostrogoths seems to have taken place among other forms of hybridization. On the Chinese side, the Huns should be identical with the Xiongnu, who came into conflict with the Chinese dynasty of the Zhao in the 5th century BC. They appear in this context as Turco-Mongol invaders, whose threat is sufficient to trigger the construction of the Great Wall. But the wall didn't stop the barbarian invasions of China, and the Huns reverted to more traditional forms of warfare. The Qin dynasty that completes the unification of China integrates ethnic tribes and is inspired by some of their customs. The Xiongnu Modu Shanyu, after killing his father Chuman, founds a Xiongnu Empire. This empire, which touches Lake Baikal in the north, inflicts a military defeat on the Chinese Emperor Gaozu of the Han dynasty, which forces him to initiate a policy of peace with the barbarians and to give his daughter in marriage to Modu Chanyu. The Huns possessed a military force that enabled them to fight effectively against other ethnic groups. We know that they had a patriarchal society and that the widow of the elder brother became the wife of the younger brother. Attempts to identify their social way of life, their habits and behavior are based on a comparative ethnology that includes the nomadic population of the countries crossed by the Huns. After his death in 174, Modu left a whole state which continued to preoccupy China for several centuries. The Huns, after the death of Modu, had to fight against other barbarian nations like the Yuezhi. The Yuezhi, who lived in Gansu in particular, belonged to the Indo-European family of Tocharian population. Repulsed by the Huns towards Bactria, they founded the Kushan Empire. The White Huns or Hephthalites who lived in the Turfan region at the beginning of the Christian era and left in Central Asia the ruins and fortresses could in fact be other descendants of the Yuezhi. The Kushan Empire was a vehicle of Buddhism and even Greco-Buddhism of Bactria in the direction of China and maintained, on the other hand, relations with Rome. Inscriptions in Greek language are linked to the Kushan Empire. So we are at the same time confronted with the history of the Huns and with barbarians building a bridge between the east and the west of the Eurasian continent. The Huns themselves may have a civilizing effect by teaching the use of iron to population near Lake Baikal who were still in the Bronze Age. The Huns occupied the space of Mongolia and, without having converted to Buddhism, knew its existence and salient features. When the Huns attack the Chinese Empire, they are not just a wild and completely primitive population. Another barbarian ethnic group is that of the Turks. In fact, the Huns, whose ethnic and linguistic roots are not absolutely defined, have perhaps also been closely linked to the Turks. It is generally said that the Turkish group originated in Mongolia, in the Orkhon Valley, where Proto-Turkish ruins have been found. Hence, a vast movement of the Turks toward the west would have begun. The Tang dynasty, particularly interested in an empire including Central Asia, pushed the Turks toward the west. The Tang hesitated between the separation of ethnic groups. There are barbarian settlements in some ports, for example, and a policy of assimilation. At the linguistic level, in any case, assimilation prevailed, and apart from Sanskrit, they didn't support the use of foreign languages. The non-Han remained savages whose bestiality was recognizable even by their physical features. In a geopolitical vision of the world, the barbarians are generally located on the periphery. It was during the time of the Tang dynasty that the Khazar Empire was created in the north of the Caucasus, an empire which included a strong Turkish nomad component. This Khazar Empire operated a strange conversion to Judaism. The presence of the Turkic-speaking barbarians who distressed China and southern Russia predated the constitution of the first Russian states, Kiev Rus or Moscow. Indeed, it seems very difficult to recognize on the basis of the few available testimonies which ethnic group made up the vast movement of nomadic peoples from the east to the west of the Eurasian continent. The Turkish peoples played obviously a central role. The Turkish presence, that of the barbarians rejected from Asia and particularly from China, is easily perceptible in Russia. Beyond the presence of a Turkish Khanate in the Crimea, whose presence in the long term is still recognizable in Pushkin's poem on Bakhchisarai, modern Russia itself is formed on the basis of wars against the Turks, especially against the Tatars. The siege of Kazan by Ivan the Terrible in 1552 is a founding element of modern Russian history. The Tatars of Kazan succeeded another Turkish state, Volga, Bulgaria, and were identifiable as descendants of Genghis Khan That is to say, they were connected with the great movement of peoples who left with Genghis Khan Mongolia, but was initially involved in the wars against the Qin dynasty. The Mongols are at least naturally part of the barbarian nations. They have their own Chinese dynasty, especially that of the Yuan from 1260 to 1368. They adopt the Chinese language, make Beijing their capital. It was during the Yuan period that Marco Polo visited China. The founder of the Yuan dynasty is a grandson of the Mongol Genghis Khan. The Mongols of the Golden Horde reached the region of Moscow in the 14th century. Toktamish burnt Moscow in 1382. It was by allying themselves with the Khanate of Crimea that the Russians succeeded in repelling the Mongols. The Mongols mingled gradually with the Turks to form the Tatar ethnic group, which suffered decisive defeats against the Russians in the 15th century. Despite the very negative common view of the Mongolian barbarians, they were much more tolerant, for example, in religious questions than on the other side, the Teutonic Knights, who from the west sought to colonize Russia by settling on the shores of the Baltic Sea. In the history of Russia, the Mongols of the Golden Horde were perhaps less dangerous barbarians than the Teutonic Knights. The question is still open among Russian historians. From one end of Eurasia to the other, a kind of Pax Mongolica had been created. It made all sorts of exchanges between the two parts of Eurasia possible, allowed emissaries of the Pope to reach Mongolia. Giovanni del Carpine arrived there in 1245. The Dominican André Longjumeau conducted 2 successive embassies to the Mongols. William of Rubruck stayed in Karakorum in 1254. There was in Karakorum a Nestorian church and Buddhist temples. The travelers met even Parisian craftsmen settled in the capital of Mongolia. The interpreters who accompanied Giovanni da Pian del Carpine in this dangerous journey were themselves Slavs, able to ensure exchanges between the European emissaries and the Mongols. Under the control of the Mongol barbarians, a link had been established between the western parts and the eastern parts of the Eurasian continent. The Mongols were welcoming towards Nestorian Christians, and the myth of a very Eastern Christianity, the legend of Prester John and his Christian state beyond the Muslim world, invited even to conclude a sort of alliance with the Mongols. All minorities living in China can be regarded as barbarians because they do not share all the characteristics of Chinese culture. However, the term seems to be reserved more specifically for the ethnic groups situated to the north, those against which the Great Wall wanted to be a defense. They are mainly Huns in antiquity and early Chinese medieval times, then Turks and Mongols who mingled and were often confused with each other. We can add perhaps the Tibetans who succeeded in founding several dynasties at the time of the 16th kingdoms. The barbarians are often sinicized, but above all they provide structures of communication between the Chinese world and Europe. The Russian historian Lev Gumilev, the son of the 2 Russian poets who were essential in the literary history of the 20th century, Anna Akhmatova and Nicholas Gumilev, after a first part of his life darkened by stays in political prison camps, published in 1960 a book on the Huns, widely identified with the Xiongnu of the Chinese history. This work, commissioned by the Institute of Orientalist Studies in Leningrad, was followed by other publications in the same field of research, a dissertation on the Old Turks, a work on the Khazars. All these works are guided by a twofold theoretical perspective on Eurasianism and ethnogenesis. Eurasianism consists in approaching the Eurasian continent no longer as an opposition of Asia and Europe, but as an ensemble at the center of which is Russia, a Russia strongly determined by its Asian part and ethnic groups to meet there. Ethnogenesis tends to consider that nations are not closed groups, but that they mingle and constitute new identities. It is therefore important to follow encounters and hybridization of ethnic groups in order to understand the emergence of new nations. In this procedure of fusion, Gumilev stressed particularly the geographical determinations in the circulation of peoples. What deserves special attention in this theoretical construction is that it is based on the rehabilitation and reassessment of ultimate barbarians at ancient times in the history of Europe and of China, as well the Huns. Gumilev wanted clearly to define the foundations of a Russian identity, but this Russian ethnos integrated, so to speak, moments of the Chinese. It obliges us to take into account in this history the geographical data of Eurasia, the areas of Central Asia and Southern Siberia, the world of the steppe, the nomads. The results of his work have been criticized by Russian sinologists who consider that the work relied on bad translations of 19th century sources. But the idea of a fundamental historical connection of Europe and China, thanks to the category of barbarians, deserves to be considered seriously. If we consider that beyond the Huns, the Mongols of Genghis Khan or the warriors of Tamerlan were also barbarians, the question of the barbarians in North China results in the very modern debate on the new Silk Road, or it obliges us to think about the new political Chinese project, One Belt, One Road. What was not yet the Silk Road and was probably neither a pure Silk Road, but was already a way of passage, constitutes for Gumilev the meeting point between a Roman Empire obsessed by its barbarians and a Han Empire that was just as much endangered. The ethnic groups are not eternal, but they are historical. They die and are replaced by others. Gumilev refers to the last empress of the Chen dynasty, which was destroyed by the Sui dynasty in 589. In captivity, she was allegedly given in marriage to a Turkish Khan who wanted to found a family with a Chinese empress. In his book devoted to the Russian ethnos, in an history ranging from Kiev, Russia, from Kiev, Russia to Moscow, Russia, Gumilev appreciated the Turkish nation as the first ethnic group that managed to unify Eurasia from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. And to conclude, it is true that the Huns did not remain a pure ethnic group, that they quickly created other ethnic groups by merging, for instance, with the Mansi of Siberia, with the Ostrogoths, and other groups, but their dissolution in a range of nomadic peoples created precisely the ethnic link between China and Europe that Eurasianism postulates. It is strange to observe that Kazakhstan recently founded a Gumilev Eurasian National University in Astana. Thank you.